So, good morning, David.
Good.
Um,
Hi.
very, very happy to see you this early morning for you. David Bollier, ladies and gentlemen, is an esteemed guest in this dialogue because he is the director of Reinventing the Commons Program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics, plus a whole range of other things. And this morning, we're going to really talk together about commoning, and also about the new agendas for the future, because basically we're facing strange times, and that's the understatement of the year. I'm Godelieve van Heteren, Health Systems Governance Collaborative. So good morning. Just to start immediately with the meat of things, because Dave, a lot of people have been asking me, what is this commoning?
Well, that's a long, complicated answer, but the short answer is it's a very ancient, but it's a newly discovered or rediscovered way of meeting our needs and governing our communities. And it's ancient in the sense that evolutionary scientists will tell us that cooperation, collaboration, sharing, commoning, the process is part of our legacy as a species, and it's what has made us so successful as a species. But arguably for the past 200 years, it's been radically suppressed in the notion of this radical market individualism. But especially over the past 20 or 30 years, especially with the rise of the internet, there's been a rediscovery of how collaboration can be a very productive, wealth-generating process in its own right, and often rivaling the activity of government and the market. And so there's a discovery of these different social systems for meeting our needs. And the Commons is really about trying to understand that better, trying to understand the social dynamics, the governance dynamics, the economic implications, how it helps us re-engage with natural systems better.
Yeah, well, this sounds like already quite a lot to unpack. One of the reasons why I really wanted to have this dialogue with you is because I feel we're really at the threshold of something, but we don't know what the something is. That's my sense of it. So what is your take on these times? I mean, we hear all kinds of sloganist language about how this is all going to be big transformational, but what is your feel about the times we're living?
Well, I think that the disruptions caused by the pandemic, the increasingly untenable contradictions of neoliberal capitalism, the lack of effectiveness of state power in dealing with their problems as a centralized bureaucratic system. I think they're all starting to fall apart, or at least we're not having credibility and trust in their ability to perform the tasks they've purported to perform in the past. So there's some rare openings, and our minds are starting to open to different possibilities.
Do you really feel, sorry to interrupt you, but do you really feel our minds an opening? Because we all participate now, I think, in a lot of reflection, all of us around the world, most citizens of the world do this. But do we have a feeling that we're opening up, or are we cramping more? Are we, there's so much anxiety as well.
Point is well taken in the sense that a lot of the authoritarian populism, I think, is a reaction and a withdrawal to old forms, in some ways nostalgic forms. So you're absolutely right in that sense. But I think it's also true that a lot of serious people who are trying to solve problems realize that there are structural issues that we have to start to address, and that the old forms are structurally flawed and need to be rethought. Now, it's a different discussion about how we actually move forward, develop the new paradigms and logics, and become familiar enough with them that we can be confident building a new world. I'm just saying that we now have the possibilities for entertaining these, which we didn't have before, say 5-10 years ago. There was only an outlier, vanguard, people on the margin who were thinking about this stuff, who really didn't have within mainstream political culture any openings to have credibility or to try to develop more beyond their marginal communities.
Okay, but can I then, because, I want to flag this book because it's such a fantastic inspirational text. And so Free, Fair and Alive, the insurgent power of the commons. Now, if you read the book, you understand what you're saying by that, because it is emerging. But to people who are outside this arena, or are all groping for new agendas, where would you say the insurgent power of the commons lies now? I mean, where are these opportunities that you see?
It resides both in very particular opportunities where people live in their place with the types of collaborative projects that are meaningful to them, one, but in a larger sense, there's I think a deeper philosophical and political dimension to it that we can only start to appreciate once we start to travel in these circles and start to get different reference points and examples. When we start to think about, for example, community land trusts and community supported agriculture as different ways to manage land, as we start to see how open source software communities and different forms of wikis and online sharing can open up new forms of knowledge and collaboration. When we start to see the work of the transition town movements, the cooperative movement, the solidarity economy, and once you start to get into some of those circles, you start to get more hopeful. You start to see things that are actually working, perhaps not with the support of the state, perhaps with the opposition of corporations, which don't like the competition. But so there will be struggle going forward, but there are many hopeful projects out there that I think we can start to connect the dots and build a new picture for the future.
Okay, can we explore a few of these a little bit further? Because in the book that I just showed, there is this magnificent list of examples. And because you are really addressing your readers with, this is not just theory, this is really something that is in the making everywhere and at many different levels. There's also something that struck me, that list, that appendix with all these concrete examples that contains examples that are very local and examples that are translocal from one setting to another, and in very different domains. So yes, there is definitely something emerging. But if you look at some of these examples, which ones, if you could just pick a few, have inspired you personally a lot?
Well, I mean, I think I'm very encouraged by the amount of experimentation going on in many cities and towns. I think a lot of this is happening at the local and municipal level, because frankly, state and national, provincial and state and national politics is often wrapped up in ideological struggles as opposed to the practical work of doing this stuff. Yeah. So for example, in Amsterdam and Barcelona, in a lot of Italian cities in Seoul, Korea, there are active engagements by the political powers that be with how to rethink municipal services in ways that are collaborating with neighborhood communities. And it's not simply the bureaucratic administration, but there's a level of citizen collaboration, whether it's a neighborhood, whether it's a farmer's market, whether it's a group of people that want to manage an abandoned building or a senior center. So there's, I think, some questing going on. And I think we frankly don't know how this is going to shake out, because we know that state power and city government has their own embedded logics. And can they emancipate themselves from that? Can they open themselves to different ways of doing? But I find that a really interesting area of innovation going on. But there's so many cross currents going on where the digital spaces are developing new platforms for organizational behavior that, again, is more flexible and egalitarian and participatory. And there's a lot of hopeful stuff there, going way beyond the corporate platforms like Twitter or Facebook, which of course are very pernicious, precisely because they're run for business purposes and they use algorithms to that intensify extremism, as opposed to empowering people to collaborate in more effective ways. So that's a whole arena of peer production. There's a whole slipstream of what's often called cosmo-local production, where you have open source design and knowledge sharing at a global level, which is surfacing world-class ideas and innovation, but then local production of the physical stuff, whether it's housing, furniture, electronic circuit boards, even there's a wiki-speed car and other motor vehicles that have been designed this way, which is, I think, the rudiments of a different production system that has far less carbon, relies less on carbon fuels, because you can have great knowledge and design, but locally sourceable production without the usual proprietary or expensive impediments of branded production. So, you know, there's these kinds of things going on that I think are hopeful, but we need to, I think, pay more attention and try to synthesize some of these diverse examples to make sense of them, because frankly, that's the challenge, to make sense of what it adds up to, what is feasible and credible, and what is kind of a little too flaky or dreamlike.
So can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think that is, I had sort of a constant dialogue with myself reading the book, because on the one hand, you feel inspired, and like you say, there are many, many examples of concrete things where concrete people, real people, are really doing a lot of things that move in this direction. On the other hand, if people are new to this or feel, where should I start, and how is it interconnected? And also, how does it relate to, let's say, the more conventional forces that organize our societies? Then you come into a kind of quagmire, and sometimes you get a bit bogged down. Like, I feel I oscillate in my own life very much between very local things and global things. And I often struggle inside myself, because you see locally what good people try to do. And then you see globally or in larger structures how hard it is to change some of that, where it does need changing. So how do you relate with that yourself? Or do you feel that tension too? Because
well, I mean, I perhaps have my own special case because I've been working in this area for 20 years, and so I have a constellation of examples and friendships and relationships that say, oh, this is a reality. Whereas a lot of people who perhaps are newer to some of these circles, it takes a while to sort of orient oneself. But I think even beyond that, we are living in an interregnum where the old systems are not working, but the new systems have not quite materialized. We don't have the infrastructures for making this easier to do. We don't have the financial systems for non-market behaviors of commoning. We don't often have the legal recognition or support for it, because the state systems tend to want to consolidate and centralize power and put it into bureaucratic systems rather than distributing it and pushing it out to empower people to come up with their own bottom-up creative solutions, internet style. So I think there's an understandable confusion, and how do we make this work? I think that's part of our struggle right now.
is it a struggle or a journey? Should we maybe use other language? Because struggle immediately sort of sounds so negative. Whereas earlier on you said,
struggle is negative. I think that's actually realistic. But I think that there are indeed great satisfactions from this kind of behavior of commoning. And I think there's also a way of escaping a lot of the control and predation and other problems, other social pathologies that neoliberal capitalism causes, from the rentier economy that is really preventing a lot of innovation, to the overhang of debt on students and homeowners, and the inability to use land in more constructive ecological ways precisely because of that debt, and on and on. So I think that there are satisfactions in leaving the old economy, and there are satisfactions in developing the new, but we don't have the systems often for making this an easier transition. I see town and city governments being in the front line of this because, as I said, it's less ideologically driven, and people can more practically come together to say, how do we make this work? But we need to start to think, well, as the cliche has it, think globally and act locally in this example, and try to get out of some of the ruts of thought that we have about market behavior and capitalism, and some of the social roles that we think we have to slip into of producer, consumer, investor, lender, and so forth. I think a lot of these binaries get scrambled in the commons because the producers are the consumers, and vice versa. The finance is often pooling finance from the community as opposed to having an external source dictate terms to a community. So it cuts very deeply, I think, the commons in terms of scrambling some of the if I can use the term, ontological, the basis of our thoughts about what reality is and our relationships. We're not isolated individuals, we're nested within communities. And once you start to think that way, you start to see it as a holistic network challenge as opposed to a problem for me alone or a problem for my organization alone.
I've two immediate sort of brainwaves listening to you. And one is, there's a lot in the global health sphere, the line of work that I work in. There's a lot of talk about community now, a lot of talk about community. And then you come in all kinds of different parts of the world where people's sense of community, roles of community are really quite differently defined. And so with some of my friends in Zimbabwe the other day, I was actually talking a little bit about commoning, and they said, well, what do you mean by that? And I tried to explain in my simple words, and then they said, well, we're doing these things already. This is not like news to us. So one question I had to you is this commoning thinking also as the new sort of the new politics, maybe the new political and social economy. What will it do if that would surface more and emerge further? What would it do to also the relationships in the world, where now you very often see that people from certain parts of the world are telling other parts of the world what to do? Whereas I had in that conversation a very strong feeling like, okay, I should keep my mouth shut and somebody else can actually tell me more.
I think that commoning might be very new to the global industrialized modern North, but I think to the global South and traditional communities,
it's old stuff.
Indigenous people, it's old stuff that has never had a discourse to properly recognize their type of social communities and how that is productive, satisfying, without having the Western so-called development model foisted upon them. So I think that we have a lot to learn from the South, and I think that it's really a group conversation, a global conversation we need to have, which is not to say that the commons in the global South will be identical to the global North. I think one of the great aspects of talking about commons is that they all are situated in local circumstances with their own histories, geographies, traditions, and values, and yet they remain commons at some level. And the point is, those contextual factors have to play out in the commons and be honored, as opposed to having a one-size-fits-all global neoliberal capitalism, for example. So the ideas of property rights being the same everywhere, we need to open that conversation up. And this is, I think, a liberation for having more locally, culturally satisfying ways of meeting our needs. And we in the West have a lot of shedding of old paradigms that we need to go through, I think.
Okay, I think that's a long journey still, but to that journey, to the collective journey, because on the one hand, I think the world at least that I experience in every part of the world where you arrive now, people are on mobile, young kids, they have they have imaginary worlds because they look at things that are very different from their parents. And so there's a lot of fluidity in how in the world things hang together. At the same time, we also see these structures, all the structures we're talking about. And so if we want to help create collectively, also in health, if we want to create more space, what would be a wise way of going about that?
Wow, that's a big question. I think it's a matter of honoring this bottom-up sensibility where it happens, as opposed to insisting upon a top-down solutionism. Because I think people have to have trust and ownership of the solutions that they're governed by. And that's one of the profound problems of our time, that I think people don't have trust. They don't have legitimacy in the institutions that govern them, whether they're transnational corporations or the nation state. So finding systems that allow that to surface and people to reclaim control of the resources that matter in their lives and their own community without, diverting into a tribalism. A lot of people think that the commons is really so pre-modern and almost barbaric because it doesn't have the civilizing qualities of the nation state and modern liberalism. But in fact, as Eleanor Ostrom, the great scholar of the Commons who won the Nobel Prize for her work in 2009, how she showed that the self-organizing capacity of communities in many humane, generative ways is everywhere. And we need to be mindful that it doesn't work naturally or automatically. At the same time, it does work. And I think these smaller, more appropriate scale approaches are going to be what's needed to deal with these mega problems like climate change and inequality, because those simply cannot be solved through fiat at the top level. They need to be working at the cellular level of society and indeed within ourselves. So that's, I think, the more appropriate location for thinking about things personally, socially, locally, as opposed to the grand institutions and political leaders who may or may not be trusted, may or may not be capable through their bureaucracies and systems of solving problems.
Yeah. Okay, which brings me to my final question, because the series that this dialogue takes part in is called Building the Reset, and it is focused to a large extent on global health and health systems transitions. And I'm very, very, well, tossing and turning in myself constantly about how the wisdom of what we've just shared, what you said, and all this emerging new set of sensibilities, the new languages that come with it, probably the new institutional formats, how we could help to cultivate this in this wider health arena, which due to the COVID at the moment is in such a turmoil, institutionally, but also practically. If you see what surfaces as misery that people suffer due to the COVID, the inequities that are in the system, the difficulties that we see in systems to cope with the challenges of this pandemic. So it is really a spotlight on so many things at once. But how can this hopeful agenda of connecting differently, rebuilding, how could that, in your view, play out in health? I know you're not a health person, but...
No, but I think that a few things come to mind immediately. Is I think care work, meaning human caring that is not something amenable to market exchange or productivity, needs to be honored in a more serious way. We saw how in the wake of the pandemic, some of the first responders were mutual aid networks that almost spontaneously sprang up without the usual resources or overhead of established institutions, and yet they were tremendously effective. How can that kind of human impulse and sensibility be leveraged and supported? How can we have larger infrastructures that both authorize and support that kind of connection at the community level, especially? And I think there are some examples out there. I know in the Netherlands, I'm quite impressed with the home neighborhood healthcare service, Buurtzorg, which has neighborhood-based nursing care, which is less productivity and top-down driven the way conventional healthcare often is, but more care driven, and indeed it's been proven to be more effective and over the long term more cost efficient. So there are these kind of sometimes counterintuitive models that honor care that I think should be supported, without, of course, abandoning a lot of the top-down infrastructures that I think we need. I mean, it's a complicated story because it depends upon what specific health sector or country you're talking about. And of course, the system is so tremendously complex and involuted that starting a new system is very difficult. I think the innovation is going to have to take place on the side and grow and mature to prove its efficacy, as opposed to jumping into the middle of the system and starting to tear it up. That's probably going to be too complicated. But can we, a lot of tech companies have so-called skunk works, where they put people out on the side to innovate, where they're undisturbed by the usual complexities, and then they prove a workable model at a certain prototype level. I think having more of that, and then taking those prototypes that work and nurturing them, giving them space, the way we've seen with universal basic income being experimented with in this community or that, and start to build like that, as opposed to being overly ambitious from the start, from the top down.
Okay. Dave, I think you gave us a lot of food for thought. I'll flag the book once more. This is not a promo, ladies and gentlemen, but actually this was so inspiring to me. So I'm very, very happy that you could make time free in your busy schedule, and hope to meet very time soon. Thank you so much. Talk later. Bye.
Bye-bye.